firms are always seeking to find that optimal level of production that will allow them to be truly profit maximizers. So that's what we're going to start looking at today. There are a number of components to that calculation. Part of it involves some of those costs that we started talking about last class. And there, remember, are a lot of different kinds of costs. So we're going to actually add a few more to our economic vocabulary today. But there's one cost in particular that we're going to want to really focus on and keep in mind, because now we're going to begin to apply the idea of marginal thinking to the business decision-making process. So that one very special cost is called the marginal cost. We'll take a look at that by the end of our time together. But before we do that, there's another complication that economists add to the profit calculation. That is, well, determining profits are indeed found by taking total revenues minus total costs. That doesn't tell us the whole story. We need to know the rest of the story. The rest of the story involves those implicit costs that we talked about last time. Because when accountants compute profit and economists compute profit, we do so in different ways. So let's take a look at an example of what it means to calculate profits from an accounting perspective and what it means to calculate profits from an economic perspective. So when economists talk about profit, they want to consider all of the various costs that go into the profit calculation. We want to include explicit and implicit costs. That will help us to determine if a company is truly profitable. It's not really enough to say, let's calculate profit using only the explicit costs like we've done thus far. So when economists look at profit, we are looking at all of the costs. So we take the total revenue minus explicit costs and implicit costs. Accounting profit doesn't look at the implicit costs, and for good reason. They're just really, really hard to measure empirically. When economists look at profit, we're going to basically take accounting profit, and accounting profit is the total revenue minus the explicit costs. So all those things that are easy to measure, labor costs, your rent, all of those things. And then we're additionally going to subtract the implicit costs. And that will give us economic profit. I mean, you can think about it this way. Even if a company makes a profit, like an accounting profit, say they make a profit of $1,000 a day, an economist wants to know if that $1,000 is enough to also cover the implicit costs, such as the value of the time that the entrepreneur is giving up. So what could the entrepreneur be doing with their time? Maybe they could be going to work for someone else. If you can't cover that cost as well, perhaps you aren't truly profitable. If the total revenue is greater than all of the explicit and implicit costs, though, then there is economic profit. Again, think about it from this perspective. Let's say that a company with, let's say, $10 billion worth of assets has a $20 million profit. Now, $20 million may sound like a lot, but the question becomes, what could that firm be doing with that $10 billion in assets that might be more profitable than earning a $20 million profit? Pulling out the old calculator, $20 million is is only 0.2% compared to the 10 billion in assets, you might be able to just shut the business down, put that 10 billion in a bank account, and earn more interest. So that's a problem for the firm if they're only earning 0.2% return on $10 billion, even though 20 million sounds like a lot of money. It really isn't, and that firm may not be using its resources in the most profitable way. So from an accounting perspective, it looks like the firm is profitable. They're earning $20 million. But from an economic profit perspective, that firm may be in trouble in the long run if they're only earning that very tiny amount of profit on the total, as a rate of return on the total assets. Okay, let's take that idea of economic and accounting profit and put it in a more perhaps tangible way. Let's say you're thinking of starting a business. During class, you like to sketch some things out, and somebody, of course, socially distancing, looks over your shoulder and sees one of the things that you've drawn. You've drawn an animal dressed like a superhero. You say, that's really cool. I would like to pay you for one of your drawings if you could maybe make that into a sticker or something. And you say, well, sure. And word gets out about your talent, and you start to sell more. And in the course of a year, you sell enough to make $10,000. You say, well, that's an awful lot of money. That's really great. Now, to determine whether you're profitable or not, you remember from economics class that you have to subtract your costs. But at first, you can't remember which costs are which. So you say, well, I know I have costs. I've had to buy some software to help me design this well, and a way to print these on stickers, and so I need some capital. And so you get all your receipts together and you figure out you have $7,000 in explicit costs. So from an accounting perspective, what is your profit going to be? Go ahead and just take 5 seconds and figure this out. Hopefully you remember how to calculate accounting profit. Now, before we get the answer for accounting profit, let's think about the economic approach to this. So if you work for somebody else, you could be earning $3,500. Those are your implicit costs, the $3,500. So now, see if you can calculate your economic profit before we do the great reveal. Okay, so accounting profit is $3,000. You take your total revenues, your $10,000 up here, you subtract your explicit costs, which are your $7,000, and you end up with $3,000 in accounting profit. But for economic profit, we need to subtract your implicit costs as well. So once we do that, you actually end up with a negative economic profit. So what's the alternative here? You could work for somebody else, or you could work for yourself. And if you want to do the most efficient thing, it may be that you should be working for someone else, even though you're making $10,000 in revenue. And it looks like, from an accounting perspective, you're making $3,000 in revenue. But because of the opportunity cost or the implicit cost, you're actually losing money, and you're not truly profitable. But there may be some other things to take into consideration. Let's take a look at a different alternative, a different second best option. What if your alternative is an internship for your major where you're paid $2,100? Now, you may already be doing some of the math here. Remember, your total revenue is $10,000. Your explicit costs are $7,000, and now your implicit costs are $2,100. So again, this is your total revenue. This is your explicit costs, and this is your implicit costs. And when you do the math there, it looks like actually the job that you're engaged in right now is the right thing to do, because from a profit perspective, your number is positive. You are clearly making more money than you're making enough money to cover your explicit costs and your implicit costs. So whatever your alternative would be. But here's where sometimes the economic models fail. Sometimes doing what makes an economic profit doesn't make sense if the alternative might lead to something down the road. What if this becomes a job for you in your major, where you make a lot more money? Well, if that's the case, you may be better off taking that lower paying alternative as opposed to continuing to do what you do. The point here is this: just looking straight at the numbers can tell you if you're profitable or not profitable. That's good information to have, of course. But we have to use some common sense here. We have to be careful that we don't let the numbers that we look at today drive our behaviors and lead us away from alternatives and lead us away from opportunities that might actually be better for us in the future. And that's a hard thing to know. That's a hard line to walk. But we need to be able to walk that line if we want to make good choices for ourselves. And that's why it's important to have people around you to give you good advice, to help you think about the alternatives that you have in front of you. All right, so there's some things to think about when it comes to profits. Profits certainly are the objective, but when we think about profitability outside of just the straight numbers, and we think about the implicit costs, the opportunity costs that are involved with the decisions that we make, decision making gets more intricate, it gets more complicated. But knowing the ideas between, or knowing the difference between economic profit and accounting profit can help us to make better decisions once we start to incorporate those implicit costs. Okay, now we're going to move on to kind of the money question here. We're going to start to apply our knowledge, apply our understanding of marginal decision making to firm decisions. So we've talked about margins in the past. We've talked about them in the context of when there's a small change to your circumstance, do you continue to do something or not continue to do something? And what we're going to be looking at here is what we call the profit maximizing decision. Firms have to decide a lot of different things, but one of the most important things a firm chooses is how much of something to produce. Not whether to produce at all, but how much should they produce. And a firm is going to want to produce the amount of an output that's going to maximize profit. And that doesn't mean they produce as much as possible, because remember what happens. The more you produce, the more, and sell hopefully, the more revenue you have, but the higher your costs. So what we're going to be looking at now is trying to determine what's the best output production for a firm. It's called the profit maximizing decision, and it can lead to a firm being incredibly successful or going out of business because they've made very bad choices. So how much should a firm produce? Well, recall, decisions about how much of something to do involve marginal thinking. We talked about this in a couple of different ways. Should I study for one more hour? Should I buy one more pair of shoes? Those are things you're doing at the margin. You're doing one more of something. If you're running a business, you might be asking, should I stay open one more hour? Does it make sense for me to stay open 24 hours, or should I be open 23 or 22 or fewer? Should I manufacture one more car or one more smartphone or one more face mask? These are the questions that firms have to answer And it's not always so obvious. It's not always, yes, you should do more of this. What we're going to do is we're going to be making this decision by comparing what we call the marginal cost and the marginal benefit. Notice that word there, marginal. When we're talking about the marginal cost, what that means is what's the additional cost to doing one more. And we're going to compare that to the additional benefit of doing one more. So let's take a look at this in context. The marginal cost. The marginal cost is the increase in your total cost that occurs from producing one more unit of something. Okay, so now we're starting to add to our understanding of costs. We have total cost, and now we have marginal cost. Marginal cost can be calculated by looking at the change in total cost. That's what this triangle means, or the Greek letter delta. It means the change. So what's the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity? Now, to make this simple for us, to help us to understand the concept rather than worry about the math too much, what we're going to be doing almost exclusively is trying to look at the change in total cost when we change output by 1 unit. So that this delta Q in our equation will almost always be 1. So all we really have to do is look at the change in total cost as we increase output by 1 unit. That should help us with the math here. So that's the marginal cost. Okay, now let's look at this in terms of production. Remember, we looked at production a little bit. We've kind of talked about some of the basics of production. Inputs are the resources that we use in the production process. Those are our factors of production. Remember, we have land and labor and capital and entrepreneurship. Well, we're going to try to reduce our model, simplify our model to just look at 2 inputs, labor and capital. This is a very traditional approach to looking at the economics of production. So we're just going to look at labor and capital as our inputs. That input becomes output, output being the product that the firm creates through a process. So here we have input. Here comes our machines and our labor and our computers and all this stuff. We kind of put it in a box and we shake the box up. And through the firm's production process, whatever that process is, sometimes we call it the black box, we end up with output. So again, it's the firm taking our capital and our labor, putting it into the box. There it goes. The box gets shaken up, and out of that box comes our output. So let's focus on this black box just a little bit. The production process that the firm goes through is sometimes called a production function. So the production function is a way of just showing the relationship between inputs and outputs. Remember, our inputs are our capital, and notice capital is abbreviated there with the letter K. The primary reason for that is the letter C is already used for something else in economics, and we'll talk about this, what C means when we talk about macroeconomics. We don't want to get these things confused, so we use the letter K, capital, that hard K sound in the letter C makes it sort of a natural choice. So our inputs are capital and labor. We're going to use those 2 inputs to turn into output. And we'll just abbreviate output with the letter Q, just like quantity that we used in our demand and supply model. To create output, it's up to the firm owner or the entrepreneur or the manager to hire and employ the right amounts of those inputs. If the manager does a bad job of this, then the firm is not going to be profitable, or not as profitable as it could be. So, for example, if the manager hires too little labor, then some of the materials and capital won't be used properly. They'll be underutilized. So if you have a bunch of machines but not enough workers for those machines, then you just have machines sitting around doing nothing. Think about it this way. Let's say we've got a worker here, and then over here we have a bulldozer, and then we have another bulldozer. Don't make fun of my bulldozers. And then maybe we have some hammers, another hammer, and another hammer. So we've got all these tools, but we only have one worker. The manager hasn't hired enough, and so this means that some of our capital is just sitting around not doing anything. That means the manager's done a pretty poor job of figuring out the right combination of capital and labor. And if that's the case, then customers are going to be unhappy and you're going to lose business. So the production function can be expressed mathematically. So don't panic when you see this. This is actually a pretty easy thing to identify and a pretty easy thing to understand. Mathematically, our production function looks like this, where Q is the quantity of output that's produced. It is a function, or in other words, it's a result of the way we combine capital, which is our K, so here's capital, and labor, which is our L. So the way we combine those things is going to determine how much output, or what the quantity of output will be. That's all we mean by the production function. And this is a very simple production function. Sometimes it's referred to as the classic production function because it's just the most basic thing. You need to have capital and labor in the classic production function because if you had just workers, and we can even add a few more here. So here's some worker, here's a worker, here's another worker, here's another worker. If all you had were workers, so this is all you have in your production function. So basically it looks like this. Those workers, it's going to be really hard for those workers to get much done because they don't have any tools to work with. How are you going to hammer a nail with your fist? I mean, you could do it, but it's going to take a long time. Similarly, if all you had was capital, if this was your production function, and all you had were the tools, well, hammers can't drive bulldozers. They don't work that way. So having just one input, or just having just capital, or having just labor doesn't really get you very far. Instead, what you want is a production function that allows you to combine both inputs so we can put these two things together and have some output. So the basic production function is one that involves tools and workers. So when we put these things together, one of the jobs of a manager, one of the jobs of the person overseeing the production process is to understand when you've got enough of these things. And from an economic perspective, we are looking at an idea that's referred to as the marginal product. The marginal product is the change in output divided by a change in the specific input. So the marginal product of labor and the marginal product of capital refer to how we change the amount of output as we change those individual inputs, labor or capital. And we have marginal productivity of both of those two things, both of those inputs. In fact, any input that's in your production process, we can calculate the marginal productivity of. Mathematically, here's what that looks like. The marginal product of labor is delta Q, remember delta is the change in, divided by delta L, which is the change in labor. And the marginal productivity of capital is delta Q over delta K, or the change in quantity over the change in capital. So let's take a look at that just for the labor side. So if the marginal productivity of labor is equal to the delta Q over delta L, what we're trying to find is how much does output change as we add another worker to the production process. So let's just say that output with one worker, so here's the amount of labor we have, one worker can produce with a fixed amount of capital, let's say 10 units. So maybe you're making hot dogs, and one worker can make 10 hot dogs in a span of 15 minutes. And if we add a second worker, then the combined output becomes, say, 22. So here's our delta L. We change the number of workers by 1, and here is our delta Q. So if we put those numbers into our equation, what we have is delta Q is 22, that's what you were producing with 2 workers, minus what you were producing with 1 worker, divided by the change in L. So we've just moved from 1 worker to 2 workers. So that gives us 12 over 1, and that's the marginal productivity of labor. The second worker adds an output of 12. We're not looking at the combined output. We're looking at, and we're not looking at the average here. We're looking at the change that is brought about by adding 1 more worker. Now, when we look at productivity, and we look at the additional productivity that 1 worker brings, it's going to become a reality that after a certain point in time, that the number of workers that we add doesn't increase output. With an increase in the number of workers, we leave capital the same. So if you don't increase the amount of capital that you have, you're just going to have more and more workers, and at some point, that increase in the number of workers is not going to really do anything for you. That idea is called diminishing marginal product. Diminishing marginal product occurs when you increase the amount of one input but leave the other one the same. And so eventually that's going to cause output to increase, but it's going to increase at a slower and slower and slower rate. So again, assuming capital is fixed, we eventually get to the point where a new worker adds less output than the previous worker. So think about this. What happens if you're running a business that clears driveways when it snows? So you hire a worker, that adds to output, it adds to productivity, that's good. So one worker can drive the truck and one worker can shovel driveways. But eventually you add another worker and another worker and another worker, and eventually you have a worker kind of like the guy we see here in the picture, who isn't really adept at shoveling driveways. And maybe we even take his shovel away from him because there's too many workers and not enough shovels to go around because we've kept capital fixed. Well, this guy's just going to go play in the snow, and he's not going to be productive. That's what we mean as we talk about diminishing marginal product. If we were to graph this out, productivity, we would see something that looks like this. Here's our total output. And here's the number of workers that we hire. We're just going to label that as labor. So what we would see is initially output goes up and it increases at an increasing rate. But then it starts to slow down, and then eventually it starts to fall off as we add more labor. So in this green part of the graph, This is what we refer to as productivity increasing at an increasing rate. Again, this is good. You add workers, and the workers that you add are more productive. The marginal productivity is higher for each additional worker that you add. Well, then you get to this part up here in the yellow, and you can see the total output is continuing to increase, but it's not increasing as fast. So as you add another worker, the marginal productivity increases, but at a decreasing rate. But it's still positive. I know it's still positive because output continues to rise. But then you get to the red area. So basically your curve has stopped going up and now it's heading down. And now you have decreasing productivity for every new worker that you add. And again, it could be something as simple as you don't have enough capital to support this number of workers. If you've ever worked at an ice cream store, you know there are times of the day where the traffic is slow. And if you were to add another worker, they'd just be standing around doing nothing. In that case, we have output decrease. We have labor basically causing output to fall. So the additional laborer doesn't add to productivity, they just get in the way. If we wanted to actually graph out marginal productivity, it would look something like this. So here we have the number of workers. So again, this is labor down here. And then we're going to put marginal productivity of those workers along the vertical axis. So what we would see would be something like this. Marginal productivity increases at an increasing rate. It increases at a decreasing rate, and then it becomes negative. So that's sort of the look that businesses are dealing with. Okay, let's see if we can put things together, put the data together to see what this looks like, just in terms of the numbers. We kind of have a visualization of it, but let's put the numbers in place. So let's say you're running a business that involves clearing driveways, and you've got on one column, the first column over here, you have your number of workers that you're going to hire, and we have in the second column the number of driveways that those workers will clear. Now notice that capital is fixed. So we only have so many shovels, we only have so many trucks. So capital is fixed here. So let's figure out what the marginal product for the first worker is. So basically, you have no workers to start with, and you're going to increase the number of workers, so this will be our delta L, and delta L is going to equal 1. Delta Q is this, the change in the number of driveways shoveled, which is your output. So we're going to take the delta Q divided by 1, and that gives us 20. We go from 0 to 20, so we've increased output by 20, we divide it by the one worker. Now we're going to do the same thing as we go from 1 to 2. Again, that's our delta L. And then we're going to go from 20 driveways cleared to 50 driveways cleared. That's our delta Q. So what do we have here? Well, 50 minus 20 is 30 divided by one worker, gives us a marginal product of 30. And we're going to do that for every time we increase a number of our workers. So we had a delta Q over 1 of 20. We have a delta Q of 30 over 1. So that gives us marginal product of 30. And here we have the situation where we are increasing marginal productivity at an increasing rate. If we were to relate this to the graphs that we were just looking at, this is our green area right here. This is where marginal productivity is increasing at an increasing rate. But that's about to stop. Because when we hire the third worker, again, keeping capital fixed, the third worker only adds 25. That's their marginal product. And the fourth worker, going from 75 to 90, only adds 15. Then the fifth worker adds 10. The sixth worker adds 5. So now we are in that area of the graph where output is increasing. That's good, but it's increasing at a slower rate. It increased by 20, it increased by 30, and now it's starting to go down. It's less than it was before. It's less than it was for the previous worker. But it's still positive, and so that's not a problem. This is diminishing marginal productivity. That's what we see here. In the yellow area, this is diminishing marginal product. That's when it starts to set in. But then we go to the seventh worker. And from the seventh worker, you can see we go from 105 and we actually decrease the amount of output produced. So this is the point now where we don't have enough shovels. People are standing around, getting in each other's way, and not as much is being produced. So here we enter the world, and then when we add the eighth worker, we have a minus 10. Here we enter the world of negative marginal productivity. This is always bad. This is the situation where you want to avoid as a manager, as somebody running a business. You don't want to hire resources that are going to cause you to produce less than you did before. That's a bad position to be in. Now, why does that happen? Well, think about what happens when you have a fixed amount of capital. You can hire more workers, and that's fine, but there's just not enough tools for them to utilize. There's just not enough for them to do. Because the added employee has less capital to work with, then they're not going to be as productive as the earlier workers. Sort of the old phrase, there's too many cooks in the kitchen, that applies here. There are extra workers, and they're eventually going to have less work to do, and they're not going to be able to add as much to the overall output. This doesn't mean at all that the worker is less skilled. It just means they have less to work with. Some of the people in my family really like to cook, and some of them are really good at it. Unfortunately, some of them aren't, and when they show up in the kitchen, it can wreak havoc. So in our kitchen at Thanksgiving, for example, we'll have my wife, my mother-in-law, one of my kids, one of my nieces, a couple of my aunts, and they're all in the kitchen, and they're having a great time being together. But there's this one aunt of mine who just loves being around people and thinks that she's going to come up with a, shall we say, an ingenious way of making the food better. Well, every once in a while she does, but oftentimes she doesn't. So when she's in the kitchen, people try to have her do tasks that need to be done that aren't going to result in a disaster. But when she's not chopping vegetables, she's kind of wandering around the kitchen looking for something to do. And she'll just start adding spices and flavors to things that don't need them at all. And every once in a while, she'll ruin part of the meal, whether it's by adding too much pepper to the gravy or adding truffle oil to the potatoes. It's like she's the negative marginal productivity in the kitchen. There's not enough for her to do, so she kind of gets in people's way. That's that idea of negative marginal productivity. There are too many cooks in the kitchen. So you've got to be careful about that. It's not just a saying. It's certainly something that can apply to productivity, to business. Usually this happens when you have just way too much labor. Whether it's too many cooks in the kitchen or too many workers with your snow shovel business, the new worker can actually interfere with the existing workers and slow them down. That's what we mean by negative marginal product. So let's take a look at an example, something again to kind of drive this home, to really illustrate what we're talking about. Let's use the illustration of a garbage company, a company that collects garbage. The folks who collect the garbage where I live, they're really, really efficient. They've kind of nailed this. But recently, the company that we use has merged with another company, and they may have to figure out some things. So when you're collecting garbage, you have certain things that we refer to as fixed inputs. A fixed input is one that is very difficult to change. It's hard to change the amount of it. If you want more, it's hard to get more. It just takes time, and they might be really, really expensive things. Usually we use the example of a factory as a fixed input. You don't just build a new factory overnight, it takes time. Similarly, some large machinery is hard to get more of if you need it. So fixed inputs are things that are hard to change. Variable inputs, on the other hand, are easy to change. These are easy to change, and usually when we look at a relatively simple production function, our fixed input is the capital and the variable input is the labor. It's usually easy to change the number of workers that you have. You just go out and hire somebody. It might take a few days to get them into the flow of work. It might take, you've got to fill out some paperwork and that kind of stuff. Maybe spend a day or two training them. But labor tends to be our variable input, and capital is our fixed input. And to change the amount of output you produce, you need to add more of the variable input. So let's see how that plays out in the garbage collection example. Okay, so with garbage, the fixed input is capital, and it's the garbage truck. Again, pretty straightforward illustration of capital. It's a tool, and it's hard to get more of these because they're very expensive. You don't just walk down to the garbage truck dealer like you would to a car dealer and pick out a truck. You have to order these things. It takes time. The variable inputs are the laborers. Now, those are easy to hire. Those are the workers that come along and pick up the garbage cans. And the output is the number of trash cans that you pick up. It's the number of customers that you serve. So, based on that, let's see what it would look like to have diminishing marginal productivity and eventually negative marginal productivity. So, here is our capital. And if we were to calculate the amount of production that would take place with this garbage truck, we would have zero productivity because there aren't any workers. We just have capital. So we need to add a worker if we're going to have any productivity. There they are. So the driver of the garbage truck makes this capital more productive. In fact, he makes it immensely more productive. So now the driver can get in the garbage truck and go start picking up garbage cans. Now the problem is not that we don't have any capital and labor. The problem is that this driver, whenever he wants to pick up cans, needs to stop the truck, make sure it's in park, check the mirrors to make sure nobody's coming down the road, carefully get out of the garbage truck, walk over, pick up the garbage can, throw it in the back of the truck, put the garbage can back, preferably with the lid securely fastened, then get back into the truck, check his mirrors once again to make sure nobody is coming, and then he can drive to the next house. And that takes a lot of time. While this guy makes the garbage pickup process immensely more productive, think about how much even more productive, how much more positively productive this garbage truck could be if we added a second worker. There they are. So now the driver of the truck doesn't have to get out to pick up the garbage can. The guy in the back of the truck can hop off the back, grab the can, empty it into the back of the truck, set the can back with the lid placed securely on top. Jump back on the truck, give it a smack on the side so the driver knows it's time to go, and off they go. This second worker is going to add enormously to the marginal productivity and the total output of production. Now, there is a potential problem for this guy, and that is that he's got to get cans on each side of the road. So maybe we want to add a second worker on the back of the truck to help the first worker so that each person can grab a can on each side of the road. It will make them more productive. Now, the question is, at this point, does the third worker increase total output more than the second worker did? In other words, is the marginal productivity of the third worker greater than the marginal productivity of the second worker? It may not be, but it's still positive. The increase in output is still positive, so that's good. And if the increase in output is still positive, then maybe we want to hire a fourth worker. But the question is now, where do we put that fourth worker? Well, I guess we could stick him in the cab with the driver. So now the two guys on the back can jump off. They can grab garbage cans. The guy in the front can jump out and maybe grab a garbage can, but he's not going to be able to do nearly as much as that third worker, and certainly not as much as the second worker. And he might start to chatter with the driver, cause the driver to get a little bit distracted. And then maybe he's got to now back up because they missed a garbage can. That fourth worker might add positively to output, but it's going to be such a small increase in output that perhaps that fourth worker isn't worth hiring. But what if we added a fifth worker anyway? Maybe this guy can stand on top of the garbage truck, start yelling directions to people in front. Make way, garbage man's coming. It is likely, however, that this guy is going to add negatively to overall output because now the driver has to drive more slowly to keep this guy safe on top of the garbage truck. And if we were to add a sixth worker and a seventh worker and an eighth worker, these people simply have nothing to do. They're just going to be in the way. They're just going to cause the production process to slow down. These workers that we've added, the last three workers, they are going to add negatively to output. We don't need them. We don't want to hire them. It's going to cause profitability to go down because now we're paying workers to basically get in the way of other workers. This is the illustration of diminishing marginal productivity. The first worker added is very productive. The second worker added is very productive. The third worker, maybe not as productive. The fourth worker, certainly not as productive. The fifth worker, very questionably productive. But then the sixth and the seventh and the eighth workers, they're negatively productive. We don't want to hire them. They might be great garbage collectors, but with one garbage truck, we don't need these people. We either fire them or maybe we get another garbage truck. Maybe after enough time, we can get a second unit of capital. But with our one fixed unit of capital, we don't hire these people. Bye-bye workers. And probably bye-bye to you, and maybe bye-bye to you. So what can we take away from all of this? Well, the important takeaway is that hiring inputs should occur at the margin, where it's not that you decide whether to hire workers or not. It's not, well, I'm either going to hire 5 workers or no workers. The question is, should I add one more worker? What's the marginal productivity of the next worker? And if the marginal productivity is negative, you certainly don't hire that worker. That's something that a manager needs to be able to think about, needs to be able to consider. And good managers are really good at doing this, even if they don't have a table of data. They look in the office and they say, all right, we have one worker at every desk. If I hire another worker, I don't have anywhere to put them. I'm not hiring another worker. Diminishing marginal productivity is okay. It's maybe not the greatest thing in the world, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't hire a worker just on the data, just on the numbers. It just means that by adding another worker, the next worker you expect to be less productive, given the amount of capital that they have to work with. The takeaway should be, if you want your workers to be more productive, you might need to add some more capital so they have something to do, so that they can actually do their job more productively. That brings us to another way of looking at costs, and those are costs in the long run. Remember, I mentioned the idea of fixed inputs and variable inputs. Well, in the short run, and that's really the time period that we've been discussing, the short run you're going to find that at least one input is fixed. So for your garbage business, you can't get another truck. Why not? Because it takes time. It takes time to actually get the truck ordered and have it put together and have it delivered. You're stuck. There's at least one fixed input. So whether we're talking about garbage trucks or the number of equipment you have to clear driveways, or if you're a restaurant, it's the size of your restaurant. It just takes time to adjust these things. Again, they're fixed. And it's a cost that the firm has to pay for no matter how much revenue they've made. Now that's an important aspect, an important concept we haven't talked about yet. Fixed inputs are also considered to be fixed costs. These major capital purchases tend to be things that businesses sign contracts for and they promise to pay. They promise to pay rent for a year in a building. They promise to have maybe 5 years to pay off their garbage truck. And you sign a contract. And if you produce zero output, you still have that contract that you have to pay for. It's a fixed cost. But if we have a long enough time period, if instead of looking at things in the context of a week, maybe we're looking at it over the course of 3 years. Over that time period, that longer run time period, the firm has the ability to adjust. It can change its production processes. It can change its production function. And it can change how much equipment it has. It can expand the size of its restaurant. It can buy another garbage truck. And so in the long run, because you're able to adjust, everything is considered to be variable. All of your inputs can change in quantity and in quality. Everything in the long run is variable. That means you can be flexible. That means if you see that you need a new garbage truck, you go get one, and you have enough time to make that happen. And you can make changes to the production process to help you to be more profitable. That variability is really a nice thing to have. It's a nice thing to be able to change. So if you have enough time, you can make changes that are necessary to be more profitable. So how do we define the short run? Well, the short run is a world or a time period in which there's at least one fixed cost. One fixed input, one thing you cannot change. That's the fixed time period. That is an undefined time in terms of, is it a day, is it a week, is it a month? But it is it's a time period where you've got to deal with this fixed input problem. The long run, on the other hand, is a time period where everything can change. So when are you able to renegotiate contracts? When are you able to be flexible with everything? It's kind of a fictitious time period, but it's a period out into the future where you are able to kind of forecast where changes can be made. You look out into the future and you say, well, 3 years from now, I can change everything in terms of the way I produce. That's the long run. There's no longer any fixed inputs. There's no longer any fixed costs. All inputs can be changed. Everything is variable. And so all of the inputs are variable, and so all of your costs are variable. That's what the long run is. So once again, we define the short run as a period where there's at least one fixed cost. And the long run, all costs are variable costs. Everything can be changed, including how many workers you have, the size of your building, the size of your operation, any agreements with suppliers. Everything can be renegotiated. That flexibility allows firms more options to reach what they're really trying to find, and that is the optimal level of production that's going to help them to maximize profits. Remember profits? That's what we're all about. That's what businesses are all interested in. That's where we're trying to go with all of this discussion. So, in conclusion, firms that sell more don't necessarily make more profit. Profits are determined by revenues and costs. We can't forget this part. So many people forget the cost part of profitability, and they do so to their detriment. They think, oh, all I have to do is make money and sell things and I'll be profitable. And the answer is no, that's not all there is to it. There are costs. Costs are defined in so many ways. We've looked at so many different costs. We've looked at total cost. We've looked at explicit costs. We've looked at implicit costs. We've even mentioned the idea of fixed costs and variable costs. There are so many different kinds of costs out there. But the number one most important cost that we will be looking at is marginal cost. Marginal cost plays the most important role in a firm's cost structure. Marginal cost is the change in total cost as you change your output. And we'll be spending a lot more time in the next few classes looking at this marginal cost. Good decision making by the firm involves comparing marginal costs to marginal revenues. It involves comparing the additional cost of production to the additional revenues that you receive when you sell that stuff that you're making. And lastly, this will be our jumping off point into our next area of discussion. And I'll explain more about this later. But here is the thing that you want to focus your attention on. This is sort of the big, giant takeaway from firm decision making. This is sort of, I guess, if you think about what's the most important thing in microeconomics, this might be it. When a firm wants to maximize profits, what it needs to do is find the output level where the marginal revenue, the additional revenue from production, equals the marginal cost. This is what's called the profit maximizing rule. If the marginal revenue is greater than the marginal cost, then firms can increase profits by producing more output, because each unit of output adds more to revenues than it does to costs. But if the opposite is true, if the marginal revenue is less than the marginal cost, then the firm is producing too much and profits are not maximized. Each additional unit is adding more cost than it adds revenue. So you want to back down. Okay, we've gone through a lot of really detailed information now in microeconomics about the way firms make decisions. We've talked about productivity, and firms really want to be productive. If they're not productive, they can't be profitable. To be profitable, you need to make sure that you are putting your inputs together effectively. So your capital and your labor. You put those two things together in a way that you are not experiencing negative productivity. That's a bad thing. You want productivity to be positive. It might be diminishing, and that's okay, but you want it to be positive if firms are going to be productive. We've talked a lot about different kinds of costs because so many people forget about the cost side of profitability. They just look at collecting the money from selling the things that they produce, the goods or the services. But if you forget about the costs, then you might have a rude awakening one day when your accountant knocks on your door and says, hey, you're not covering your costs. You can't stay in business. You're not paying your workers. You're not paying for the inputs that you need. But probably more important than anything else, and the thing that we're going to move into as we start to take a look at different types of different ways that businesses relate to each other. Probably the most important aspect of all of this notion of profitability is this profit maximizing rule, to find where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Because a firm can produce a lot of different outputs, but there's only one that's going to maximize profit. And we've just sort of mentioned that idea here at the end of our time together today, but we're going to spend a lot more time with that idea going forward as we start to take a look at the different ways that businesses relate to each other in what's called market structure. So that's where we're headed now. We're going to use these ideas of profitability and margins and marginal decision making to help further our understanding of the way businesses interact with each other.